Jake
Yeah.
from Australia. How are you?
Hey, Jake. What's up, man?
Going well. How about you?
Australian is such a happy accent.
It
You
is.
guys
We're
can't
happy
seem
over here.
pissed off. Yeah. Guys.
Hey, I got a question for you. So I've been studying like on this Noahide thing. So I've been studying a lot of Talmud myself because I have the Talmud, which is a blessing. But do you have any advice as far as like how to study it? Because I'm finding at the moment that when you go through the Talmud and you start reading it, the things that they argue about, they just seem to be so, I don't know, so the arguments seem to be really ridiculous. So
Trivial.
Yeah, so trivial. Like I was reading the other day about fire on Shabbat and whether we are allowed to put an extra log on the fire, like just prior to Shabbat, and it's just like, and they're talking about how it has to be burned on 2 sides or 3 sides. And it's like, really? Haven't we got better things to do than talk about a log being burnt on, prior to Shabbat? Like,
They don't burn logs on Shabbat anymore.
so how do you read the Talmud? Like I read it and I look at it and I think, okay, wow, this is ridiculous. What are we even arguing about here? So is there any advice that you can say to like a novice Torah?
Sure. But I'm going to tell you guys now, it's a little controversial. Rabbis know this, so the more knowledgeable ones will acknowledge it. Talmud study, honestly, in terms of wanting to please God and wanting to live a proper kosher lifestyle, is meaningless. The base is the Mishnah. Now, clearly, the base is the Torah, but you can't run a whole society. You can't run a whole nation just on give or take 613 mitzvot. It's the Mishnah. If something doesn't appear in the Mishnah, it's not halakha. I would say that probably at least 50% of what we consider Jewish law nowadays, probably 80%. It's probably 50% if you go back to the Rambam, 80% if you start including Kabbalah and Mishnah Power and all these different minhagim that have crept in. Probably around 80% of what we keep today in the Jewish world and what every rabbi yells about that we're going to get Gehenna for if we don't do it, and it's a desecration of God's name, all that is all fluff and not binding. The meat is the Mishnah. That's it. And the Mishnah is not such a big book. Now, if you want to split hairs a little bit, you could also include the Braitot. So the Braitot are legal rulings that didn't make it into the Mishnah. The binding portions of the Braitot are called the Toseftot. But it's still the Mishnah. That's really the bulk.
What do you mean codification though? Like, isn't that like when you're, because I got the Mishnah as well and you read it and it does tell you law, but then the same when you read Rambam, it tells you pretty much the same thing, no?
Before we get to that question, this is probably the most profound thing you guys could take with yourselves tonight, that the Mishnah is the base. Most people don't teach it like that. Now, there's some rabbis who delve on this concept when they're looking for a lenient interpretation to a modern day practice. There's a rabbi named Rabbi Chaim Ovadia who does this all the time. Also, like Rabbi David Bar Chaim delves a little bit in this area. Most people don't teach it like this because you get thrown under the bus. The Talmud is the Mishnah and its commentary called the Gemara. However, the rabbis in the Gemara didn't sit on the Sanhedrin because there was no Sanhedrin. The rabbis in the Gemara are called Amoraim. Amoraim did not have smicha, with the exception of 2 of them, 2 or 3 of them. The Rabbi Zera got it. But when they got it, there was no Sanhedrin, and it was about to be abolished. It was about to disappear amongst the Jewish people. However,
so the rulings in the Talmud from the Mishnah are the rulings from the Sanhedrin, 2,000 years ago?
Correct.
And the Gemara is from these other rabbis who weren't on the Sanhedrin.
Correct. Now, there's 2 Gemaras. There's the Babylonian and the Jerusalem. Now, we know it as the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, but it's really the Babylonian Gemara and the Jerusalem Gemara because they're both commenting on the same Mishnah. But these rabbis, here, for example, the Amoraim, go hundreds of years after this, all the way to the 5th century of the Common Era.
So these rabbis have no legal standing of changing any of Mishnah at all.
Changing, adding, removing, correct. The reason they were important to us is because they were the students closest to the Tanaim. The Tanaim were the rabbis that appear in the Mishnah. They were the ones who created laws. I don't know if you guys saw, like in my, I think in the last month, I may have mentioned it a few times in a video. I made a video on how one shouldn't get drunk on Purim. Now, I made that video probably like 8 years ago, but I was using the Rambam back then. And the Rambam does bring down at least drinking a little bit, taking a nap. So one will not be able to tell the difference between blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Haman. However, this year, I chose to look into it and see if it appears in the Mishnah. It doesn't appear in the Mishnah. This whole scenario was created by Amoraim. The whole argument of one getting drunk, all this stuff has no place in the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't bring down drinking on Purim. Now, I know that many years I've told people to just go straight to Mishneh Torah, and it's true. To be a normative Jew in what's considered halakha today, the Rambam's Mishneh Torah, which is a codification of all the laws that appear in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, in the Braitot, in the Toseftot, in the Sifra, the Sifri, in the Mechilta, and the Geonim. That's what the Rambam codified in 14 volumes known as Mishneh Torah. However, the Geonim also didn't have smicha. There's many things that we take straight from the Geonim. No one asked a question.
So then they're not legally binding. Is that correct?
That's right. It's not legally binding. Now, what I have equipped you guys with right now are the tools to be able to corner any rabbi with some silly idea he may be peddling and win the discussion, because he would have to agree that these people did not have smicha. Now, like, if he's more Kabbalistically inclined, they don't care about the notion of smicha because, well, it depends how educated he is, because we have smicha nowadays, but the smicha nowadays was invented in 1538 of the Common Era. So people think like, oh, what do you mean? My rabbi has smicha. Heck, I have smicha. But it doesn't mean that it's the same smicha that was given from Moses to the elders to Yehoshua and on and on and on. And disappeared after the destruction of the Second Temple. That smicha was long gone. In 1538 of the Common Era, the Mari Bey Rav in Sfat, there was a rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Bey Rav, under the instructions of the Rambam, because nowhere in the Talmud does it say how to reestablish smicha once it's been destroyed. So smicha is ordination, by the way. So the Rambam says that it seems to me, and he says this in his Parasha Mishnayot, he also says it in Sanhedrin, that if you get all the Chachamim in Israel, all the wise teachers in Israel, to agree to give smicha to one individual, that person can then give smicha to someone else, and then we could start the whole process, the whole legal process, the Beit Din Hagadol, the Sanhedrin, and build a court all over again. However,
Rabbi David Bar Yochai is trying to do that.
No, he doesn't endorse. You mean David Bar Chaim doesn't endorse?
Oh, sorry, the Bar Chaim. So that's what I mean.
Yeah. There's a new Sanhedrin nowadays, by the way, and he doesn't endorse it. No one takes that Sanhedrin seriously. But I'm not speaking about that Sanhedrin that was invented, I think, in the 90s by a Lubavitcher. Like the Nasi was Adenstein salts. I'm talking about smicha 500 years ago being created as a ceremonial thing.
Isn't smicha related to the Shekinah? How can they say, oh, we agree if there's not a succession, a direct succession?
I never heard that it was.
Moses passed along everything, and there was a continual lineage. How can you recreate that?
He passed it on to the elders. God said that he was going to put on the elders what he put on Moses. And this was passed on to other judges. Yehoshua was also a judge, and on and on. I mean, Israel has had judges, and those judges were headed by priests, because the high priest was always the Nasi of the Sanhedrin till the priesthood became corrupted. And then the judges just took over, and it became ceremonial that someone from the line of David should sit as the Nasi. But the Shekinah, as being necessary to pass on smicha, like I don't know. I just thought that was part of the whole. No, it sounds nice that God put on the elders. What did he put on them? An authority to rule, but maybe being that God doesn't have hands. I mean, the notion of smicha, the term is used with sacrifices. We do the process of smicha whenever we sacrifice. We're supposed to put our weight on the animal that we're sacrificing, I guess in some symbolic way for all the messianics out there, that this thing is taking my sins away. So that's also called smicha, because it means to lean or to empower something else. But the Mishnah is the source. And it's not a coincidence that the Rambam first created a commentary to the Mishnah, which till today hasn't been translated into English. I mean, some sections are like Shmone Prakim, the 8 chapters, his Hakdama to Perkei Avot, also his Hakdama to Perek Chelek. That's where we get the 13 principles of faith. That's not in Mishnah Torah. That's in his commentary to the Mishnah. But there are many commentaries from the Mishnah, from Kahati. There's many things that could help us studying just the text of the Mishnah, that if you really wanted to feel that, heck, what do I have to do to live like the sages did when there was a temple standing? It's not what appears in the Talmud. It's only what appears in the Mishnah. And that's what people fail to ask nowadays, because they don't ask what the halakha is. They ask, what do people do? And that's a big problem.
What does the Gemara say almost? As reference, like they will rather look to an outside opinion rather than directly to the source, which is the Mishnah.
No, the Gemara is the commentary to the Mishnah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They rather look to the commentary rather than the actual source.
Oh, right. No, because the commentary, and many times puts it in layman's terms, because the Mishnah is not easy to understand. This is why, like, if you're going to study the Mishnah, it's better to study it with a commentary, more like a modern day commentary, like modern day in the sense of the last 600 and 700 years, to tell you what a certain word really means, what they're arguing about. But if you get stuck with the rabbis in Babylon and the rabbis who lived in Yavna and Tiberias, then you've already departed from the lifestyle, the religious lifestyle that Israelites lived when there was a temple and there was a Sanhedrin and there was a priesthood. And this distinction is never made nowadays because people don't care. They're like, it's in the Talmud. No, that's already like baby steps. If you guys want to pick up and start running, go back to the Mishnah. And there isn't really any further to go there. If you guys master the Mishnah, they'll tell you that, oh, well, we have minhagim, we have practices that were developed later on. The average rabbi nowadays doesn't respect smicha, old-time smicha. Why? Because they've developed notions like Das Torah, like Yeridat Hadorot, like Ruach HaKodesh, like modern day being empowered by the Holy Spirit to make judgments. And that's what Das Torah is. Das Torah teaches that every gadol, every Adam gadol, is what's called a Sefer Torah Chai, that he's a walking Torah scroll. And he has some sort of mystical tradition going all the way back that gives him an authority to establish things into reality and into law. These are, heck, it's not fully Kabbalistic. There's many Haredim who are not big into Kabbalah who believe this. This is why that we have the notion of Gedolim nowadays, big rabbis who people think have the authority to create new things. These are people who don't respect the process.
So does the Mishnah, does that give them authority to do what they're doing? No.
No, absolutely not. Authority amongst the Jewish people starts and ends with smicha. And this is how Shulchan Aruch brings it down, and even the Mishnah Torah. It makes a distinction between teachers with smicha and teachers without smicha. But people nowadays make no distinction. I think I'm the only one who constantly repeats this whole notion that there's a hierarchy to what we believe in. How many people have I argued with on YouTube that their biggest argument or like their biggest source is a rabbi who lived 100 years ago, especially the Ger rabbis? Because these guys will be like, oh, well, like, because they're equipping their students to respond. They're like, if they ask you this question, tell them you poskin like Rabbi Soloveitchik. Well, you know, Rabbi Soloveitchik lived 80 years ago, at least the older Soloveitchik. With the Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik died maybe 20 years ago. You're talking about rabbis who lived in the last 200 years. You're using that as a basis to justify your religiosity to the world, as this is, I believe I'm a Noahide, I'm a Ger, and I believe I'm going to heaven because of this, because of what a rabbi said 200 years ago. This is not the way you equip your students to respond, unless your students are only responding to Christians. Yeah. It's nonsensical. If you guys really want to equip yourself, master the Mishnah. Now, once you know the Mishnah, being that the goal is to be part of the Jewish world, you also have to master the Gemara, because that's where they're going to come at you with. You're going to have to know the arguments for them to say, yeah, I know that Abaye says this, Abaye is an Amara, but if Rabbi Eliezer says this, Rabbi Eliezer is a Tana. Rabbi Akiva said this, he's a Tana. And Amara cannot disagree with the Tana, although it happens.
So will you get like some of the Rabbi Akivas like disagreeing actually with the Mishnah?
There was no Mishnah in the time of Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Akiva was a character that appears in the Mishnah. See, the Mishnah was put together where there's a debate if it was actually written by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi or just compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. I think it's a machloket between Rashi and the Ramban. He compiled all the notes of the era of Tanaim and before. So Tanaim were men who had smicha. Now, Hillel is not considered a Tana. He's considered one of the Zugot, but it's still before the Tanaim. So it's still in the realm of Mishnaic rabbis. There was no Mishnah in the time of Rabbi Akiva, in the time of Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Eliezer. Why? Because the court was still functioning. You wouldn't need to write down their rulings because a ruling developed by the court today could be abolished tomorrow. Like, why the heck would you need to write it down?
Well, that's actually interesting you say that, because Rabbi David
Bahrain, yeah,
he said the other day when I was listening to it, he said if the Sanhedrin comes back into play now in the 21st century, he said the Mishnah gets put almost redundant and the rulings then come directly from the court.
correct.
So obviously, that's correct. Okay, right. Yeah.
That's why there was no need to put down the Mishnah in any written form, because it was meant, these laws were meant to be fluid. Now, Judaism is completely engulfed in these laws that, in my opinion, probably really should have never have been written down. But that's all we study nowadays. And I understand, because in order for us to be redeemed in the exile, that we're going to be redeemed keeping the law in a unified manner. And the Torah itself doesn't really give us a legal identity as a people. It tells us to keep Shabbat. It doesn't tell us exactly how to do it. Being that there's a death penalty attached to it, there better be some consensus on how it's done. And that's only done through civil law, i.e. halakha. But you better believe that the rabbis in the Mishnah, the rabbis in the time of the Second Temple and the First Temple, were not keeping halakha the way the Gemara says. The customs that were created in the Gemara as good ideas, I'm not saying they're bad. See, this is how we confront and deal with a primitive mind. Okay, a primitive mind thinks that only because you're not parading a certain idea and embellishing it, that you think that it's bad and then it should be destroyed. I'm not saying that the ideas and teachings in the Gemara are bad. I'm making a distinction of what's actually binding. If there was a court, they wouldn't put you to death, but they wouldn't punish you or fine you for anything that you failed to do that appears in the Gemara. Why? Because in the time of the Gemara, there wasn't a court. That means anything they developed later on as what's called midat hasidut, something that's nice to do but not mandatory, would not be considered halakha. I mentioned the last class about Asher Yatzar. So Asher Yatzar is the prayer that we say after we come out of the bathroom. So I was just curious, where is the practice of saying Asher Yatzar from? It's clearly a nice thing. And,
is it?
What?
Is it a good thing that we're saying a bracha after coming out of the bathroom?
What? I mean, it has nothing to do with the actual act that you just did, but you're praying.
Yeah, I know.
Right. I mean, you're thanking God that everything is working properly. And
It's Kabbalistic.
no, it's not Kabbalistic. It's in the Gemara, but it's not in the Mishnah. I believe it's Abaye who broke down Asher Yatzar. Kaddish. Kaddish is like the central. Kaddish is from the time of the Geonim. Now, it's not a bad thing. That's the thing. See, the problem is the silly rabbis nowadays, because I guess they're not too bright, they'll take things from the Geonim, they'll take things from the Rishonim, from the Achronim, lump it all in together and call this all halakha and say that Rabbi Akiva even wore a black hat. There's so much to be done in the Jewish world. There's so many books to be translated. There's so many things to be taught in a proper manner that in case you guys are feeling, what can I bring into the mix? What can I bring into the Jewish world that hasn't been brought already? There's so much out there to do.
I think this is the thing. This is where I get confused, and you've really cleared it up for me, Rabbi. But as far as like going back to my original question, how putting wood on a fire, like this Torah, this lifestyle that we do, this philosophy that we commit our lives to, it says it's supposed to be easy. It says it's supposed to be. It's not too far for you. It's not over the sea. It's not in the sky. It's very near you. And then when you start reading all these things, you're just like, oh my God, are you kidding me? This is so difficult. Like, how am I supposed to do this? But I think, like if it's just coming down to like, get rid of the fluff and then just go with actual what's there, it does make it easier.
Now, let's go a little bit deeper here. There's another realm. There's something known as non-binding halachot. Non-binding halachot. Binding in the sense of what? That when we're dealing with law and failing to keep the law, the first thing we assume is that there's going to be a court that's going to adjudicate us or punish us for not keeping a law, correct? So any statement that's brought down as a law, a rabbinic law, that you don't get punished for is considered almost just like good advice as well. But of course, this is something that you have to think about to be able to act it out correctly. For example, we have a law of Oneg Shabbat. It says in Isaiah, I think Isaiah 55, that one should rejoice on the Sabbath. Great thing, rejoice on the Sabbath. It's brought down as a halakha. Now, is a court going to punish you for not rejoicing on the Sabbath? Of course not. It's like a halakha that if you don't keep, there's no consequence for. Now, if you would break down Jewish law like this, I mean, I'm surprised there hasn't been books written like this to separate what's actually binding and what's just good advice. What can I get punished for if there was another Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin wasn't thought police. They didn't really care what you thought or believed. They just wanted to make sure that you were behaving in a proper manner. They were laying down consensus that dealt with behavior so Israel could shine ethically. Being ethical from a social perspective has nothing to do with what you believe. It's how you behave.
So this is one thing I've always struggled to understand is how are they going to place you if you're having a cheeseburger at home? Like, how does this work,
In that case, you would need witnesses. So
surely they wouldn't be placing those sorts of things. They want to place you on ethical things, like you say, on whether...
No, but there's ceremonial things that they'll police you on. They would lash you. You for sure get punished for not keeping rabbinic law. How can they know, if you're eating pork at home? There's, I think, you have karas for that. And karas would require you, I guess if you want to become free from it from a rabbinic perspective, to get lashed. Or, from a Torah perspective, really, karet from a Torah perspective means that you're cut off from Jewish people. The rabbis have understood it differently. There's, I think, 7 or 8 things that the Talmud brings down of what karet actually, what happens to someone who's like karet. And being that they all contradict each other, it shows that nobody knows. As a matter of fact, that's the reason they created smicha. Now, it's not a coincidence that smicha, or the new smicha, I'm not saying the original smicha passed down from teacher to student all the way from Moshe Rabbeinu. The smicha, the modern day fake smicha that we have nowadays, the ceremonial smicha invented by the Maribe Rav in Sfat. The reason it was invented was because of the Spanish Inquisition and the creation of the Marranos. You had many Jews who converted to Christianity, who the understanding by many rabbis was that because they converted to Christianity and many times lived like a Christian publicly, they were chayav kares. They were liable for excision, whatever that actually means. And according to the Talmud, the way to remove kares from a rabbinic perspective socially is with lashes. But it has to be lashes put upon you by the Sanhedrin. So the goal was to start smicha and form a new Sanhedrin to free people from under the burden of karet. This is something that's really not taught. But anyways, to get back to what we were talking about before, because I know it's very popular nowadays for people to call each other names, especially with these idiot rabbis on YouTube. It seems like they really haven't learned source material much by the way they disagree with so many other rabbis who just happen to disagree with them via chidushim. Not that they're contradicting anything in the Talmud or in the Mishnah, but because of their opinions. Just because they happen to disagree with their opinions, they call him apikoris, they'll call him a min, they'll call him a kofar. And I'll tell you this today, and this is something that you can tell them. According to halakha, there's no such thing as a min or an apikoris or a kofar unless you're disagreeing with something in the Chumash or you're disagreeing with something in Mishnaic literature, in the Mishnah and before. That's it. Not even if you disagree with Amoraim. But analyze it next time. The next time you hear someone being called one of these ugly terms, and it could be me. There's many people who call me apikoris, they don't even know why they're doing it. They're just repeating what some other silly rabbi said. But analyze it for yourself and see what they're actually disagreeing with. Are they using these ugly names just because you happen to disagree with the custom? Or are you really disagreeing with something in Torah Shebektav in the 5 books of Moses or in the Mishnah and before?